سلام بینندگان عزیز. امروز گفتگویی داریم با یکی از شخصیتهای برجسته بین المللی، شخصیتی از انگلستان، آقای لیام فاکس. ایشون نماینده پارلمان هستن و وزیر پیشین دفاع انگلستان. قصد داریم در خلال این گفتگو بعد از دیدار اخیری که ایشون داشتن از اشرف سه و با رزمندگان مجاهد دیدار و گفتگو کردن، در این رابطه با ایشون صحبت کنیم. آقای فاکس از سال 2016 تا 2019 وزیر تجارت بین المللی و از 2016 تا 2019 و قبل از اون هم بین سالهای 2010 تا 2011 وزیر دفاع انگلستان بودند. ایشون در سال 2005 وزیر خارجه دولت سایه و از 2003 تا 2005 هم رئیس حزب محافظه‌کار انگلستان بوده. ما در رابطه با دیدار اخیرشون از اشرف سه و موضوعات مختلف پیرامون ایران و قیام مردم ایران با ایشون گفتگو می‌کنیم. Hello, Mr. Fox. Welcome to INTV.
سلام آقای فاکس، بسیار خوشحالیم که با ما هستید. نخست میخواهم در مورد سفر اخیر شما به اشرف سه و بازدیدتان از موزه اشرف سه بپرسم.
I think it's very easy for people to see it as just a series of dreadful atrocities and abuses of human rights. But what struck me the most from my visit was not the cruelty and the wickedness of the people who were carrying out torture and imprisonment and execution, but the dignity and the courage and the commitment of those who endured all that suffering and whose spirit is continued today in the Iranian resistance movement.
Mm-hmm. And in Ashraf 3 you had time to...
از صحبت‌هایی که در اشرف سه با اشرفی‌ها داشتید چه نتایجی گرفتید؟
Well, I talked to people who had actually experienced the suffering and the degradation imposed by the regime on those who were unfortunate enough to be the victims in their prisons. Mm-hmm. And it was very moving to hear people talk about, you know, what it was like to see friends executed, to be tortured themselves. And there's this incredible sense of dignity. And what struck me was that the desire for freedom, as I said while I was there, is so deeply ingrained in the human soul that no amount of barbarity can suppress it. And that for me was the number one lesson. And again, the dignity but commitment of people to that freedom amongst those that I met at Ashraf 3 was very humbling.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned the role of the women in Iran.
شما همچنین در سخنانتان به نقش زنان در ایران در مبارزه با رژیم اشاره کردید. نقش زنان را چگونه می‌بینید و جهان برای حمایت از زنان در ایران باید چه کار کند؟
I think a lot of people don't really understand how much the regime seems to hate women. Some of the worst stories I heard about torture, for example, were those that were aimed at women in the Iranian prisons. And there are very few, if any, other places that I can think of around the world that specifically seek out women to be the victims of their violence in the way that the current regime does. It's a deeply misogynistic regime. I found it difficult to try to get my head around why that should be. But the courage of Iranian women in taking on the beast that is the Khamenei regime is quite remarkable. And I would like to see more support around the world given not just by women's groups but by all human rights groups to the women especially who have been putting so much at risk to fight for the rights not just for women but for all their fellow citizens.
Yeah. Other topic is the Iranian nuclear program, and some still hope to revive the JCPOA.
یک موضوع دیگر برنامه اتمی رژیم ایران است. برخی هنوز امیدوارند برجام را احیا کنند. شما مخالفت کاملتان را با برجام ابراز کرده اید. از نظر شما سیاستی که باید به ازای آن در پیش گرفته شود تا بتوان به مسائلی مانند موشک‌های بالستیک و تروریسم رژیم پرداخت چیست؟
You need to have a much more holistic view, I think. Dealing with the nuclear issue alone was not sufficient, and let's remember that the JCPOA didn't ultimately seek to stop Iran having a nuclear weapon, merely to delay it for a number of years, which was a change from the initial view, which I think was a mistake. But if you're going to do that, you also need to make sure that they cannot deliver a weapon. To the ballistic missile program needs to be taken into account. It is, of course, in breach of UN resolutions at the present time. The wish to destabilize their neighbors is deeply corrosive. That needs to be tackled too. Their export of terrorism, including to Europe, needs to be dealt with, and the way that they will use proxy terror to destabilize other countries, Lebanon, Syria, and so on, needs to be taken into account. The focus is too narrow of the agreement, and even where it does deal with the nuclear issue, it doesn't go far enough.
Mm-hmm. And the other issue is human rights issue.
موضوع دیگر بحث حقوق بشر و جنایاتی است که رژیم علیه مردم ایران مرتکب شده است. بخشی از این جنایت‌ها همانهایی است که شما هم به آن اشاره کردید، مثل قتل عام 67. بخش دیگر وقایعی است که همین الان در جریان قیام رخ می‌دهد. از نظر شما جامعه بین‌المللی برای حسابرسی از رژیم ایران به خاطر پرونده حقوق بشری آن چه کار می‌تواند بکند و چه کار باید بکند؟
This is a regime that has no respect whatsoever for human dignity or human life. And that has been true since the beginning of the regime, since Khomeini took over with the massacres in 1988, right through to the present day. The policy hasn't changed. Perhaps it becomes more extreme or more widely used at any one time, but the inherent viciousness of the regime hasn't altered. And I think that needs to be taken into account when we think about how we deal with Iran, and also when you're talking about limitations.
You also spoke about the need.
شما همچنین گفتید که سیاستگزاران غرب باید در مقابل شیوه‌های وحشتناک رژیم ایران بایستند و روشن کنند که ما به چنین رژیمی که هیچ صلاحیت اخلاقی ندارد باج نخواهیم داد. فکر می‌کنید چه اقدامات مشخصی در این زمینه باید در پیش گرفته شود؟
Well, we continue with the sanctions that we have at the present time, if necessary, tightening them. I would like to see the IRGC regarded as a terrorist organisation. I would like to see it proscribed in the UK. I've also, in the British Parliament, been talking about why we should ban Iran Air from using our airports. We need to think of as many ways as possible of making clear our opposition to what it is that they're doing. But we also have a duty to tell people what is happening and use all the means at our disposal to ensure that as wide an international public as possible recognize what is being done in Iran today.
آیا هیچ گونه مسئله حقوقی وجود دارد که مانع لیست‌گذاری سپاه پاسداران به عنوان یک گروه تروریستی توسط دولت شما بشود؟
I think it's a political argument. I have argued and will continue to argue that they should be regarded as a banned organization. The IRGC are the means by which a hugely distorted, dishonest and vicious theocratic government impose their will on the Iranian people. They are the vehicle by which the mullahs oppress the people of Iran, and they need to be held to account for their behavior.
Okay, so you've also expressed your support to the 10-point plan of Mrs. Maryam Rajavi. What do you see in that?
شما حمایتتان را از برنامه 10 ماده‌ای خانم مریم رجوی اعلام کرده اید. در این برنامه چه چیزی می‌بینید که از آن حمایت می‌کنید؟
Well, first of all, I think she's a very remarkable woman, brave. She has gone through so much herself in terms of the cost to her and her family in maintaining her very principled approach to the wicked behavior of the regime. And I think that what she offers is a practical way forward. Very often you get a lot of rhetoric from would-be leaders. What she has set out is a roadmap that makes sense, I think, and I wish her well. And if she wasn't such a strong leader, the regime wouldn't be putting so much effort into trying to undermine her and her organization.
شما به مردم ایران اشاره کردید. در پایان این گفتگو می توانید به صورت مستقیم با آنها صحبت کنید، همانهایی که در داخل ایران این مصاحبه را تماشا خواهند کرد.
Well, you need to know that you're not alone, that the world is watching, that the world regards the regime as one of the world's most evil, corrupt and vicious regimes, that the world wants you, the people of Iran, to determine your own future, to enjoy the democracy, the human rights and the freedom that we take for granted, and to be able to exist under a rule of law which is impartial, which is not theocratic, and which is modern. All of these things you deserve, and ultimately we will do what we can to ensure that you have the future that you deserve. You can and you must.
بسیار ممنونم آقای لیام فاکس. خیلی ممنون.